You can't pay your rent. Giant alien woman confronted the human. What happened next changed everything. The knock on the door of Unit 4C came at exactly 9 in the morning, the way it always did on the 2nd of the month, and Tobias Kessler knew who it was before he crossed the room to answer it. Nobody else on Holloway Row knocked like that. 3 even strikes, a pause, one more, like a metronome that had been taught patience and resented it. He opened the door and had to tip his head back to look at her. Sarai Vondrak filled the frame the way she filled every doorway in the Lowmarket district, because the doorways in the Lowmarket district had been built for humans, and she had not been. She stood a full 3 feet over him, slate-gray skin catching the corridor's cheap fluorescent light in faint threads of blue that ran beneath the surface like veins of something more expensive than the rest of her. Dark hair, bound back in the collector's braid-in clasp that marked her rank in the Vondrak Guild ledgers. Her eyes were a deep, banked amber, the color of a fire someone had decided not to put out but also not to feed. She was holding a data slate the way other people held a verdict. "Kessler," she said, not unkind, not kind either, a word used as a placeholder for a name she'd said 100 times and stopped noticing the shape of. "2nd of the month. I know what day it is, Sarai." "Then you know what I'm here for." She didn't look past him into the apartment, which he appreciated in the distant way you appreciate small mercies from people who hold power over you. 640, same as last month, same as the month before that. Tobias had the number in his head before she finished saying it, the way he had most numbers in his head these days. What he'd earned on the dock that week, what the clinic had charged, what was left after both of those numbers had finished eating each other. He had 410 credits in the tin behind the stove, and he had known for 3 days that 410 was not going to become 640 by the 2nd of the month, no matter how he turned it over. "I've got 410, he said. "I'll have the rest by Friday. I picked up an extra shift at the loading dock night crew. They're paying premium for it." "You can't pay your rent." She said it the way she said everything, flat and level, a fact being confirmed rather than a question being asked, and something in Tobias's chest did the thing it always did when a number came up short. A kind of quiet, practiced bracing, the posture of a man who had learned that the floor sometimes moved and had decided the only sane response was to plant his feet and wait it out. "Not all of it, not today," he said. "I'm not asking you to forget it, I'm asking for 4 days." Sarai looked at him for a long moment. Keith Ronnie faces did not do the same things human faces did. There was no eyebrow to lift, no mouth corner to twitch, but there was a stillness in her that human faces couldn't produce either, a kind of geological patience, as though she were giving the information time to settle through several strata before she answered. Behind him, in the small kitchen, he heard the scrape of a chair, and he knew without turning that Wren had climbed up onto it to see over the counter, and was watching the giant alien woman in their doorway with the frank, unblinking curiosity of a 7-year-old, who had not yet been taught to be afraid of debt collectors. "Who's short?" Wren said, not quite a whisper. "You or her?" "Wren." Tobias didn't turn around, but he put enough into the word that she understood it as the whole sentence it was standing in for. Sarai's gaze moved past his shoulder, found the girl, and stayed there half a second longer than professional interest required. Tobias watched something flicker behind the banked amber, not softness, not yet, but the recalculation of a person encountering a variable that hadn't been in the file. "Friday," Sarai said, looking back at him. "The full 640. I logged the shortfall as pending, not forgiven. If it isn't paid by Friday close, the guild adds the standard penalty and I file the notice the day after. That's the arrangement I'm authorized to offer. It is not generous. It is what the ledger allows." "That's more than fair." "It isn't fair, it's policy." She was already keying something into the slate, the motion brisk, final, a woman closing a transaction rather than opening a kindness. "Friday, Kessler." She turned to go, and it was Ren's voice that stopped her, not the words so much as the pure unguarded delivery of them, a child announcing an observation rather than making a request. "You're really tall," Ren said. "Do you want tea? We have tea. It's not very good tea, but Dad says it's the thought." Sarai stood in the corridor with one hand still on the doorframe, and for the second time in 90 seconds Tobias watched her recalibrate. Collectors were not offered tea. Collectors were, at best, tolerated with the wary courtesy of people minimizing exposure to a hazard. He had never in 11 months of mist and near-missed rent seen anyone on Holloway Row offer Sarai Vondrek so much as a chair. "I have 4 more units on this floor," Sarai said, which wasn't a no exactly and also wasn't a yes, and she was gone down the corridor before either of them could decide which it had actually been. He did not, in the end, need until Friday. He needed until Thursday night, when the extra shift on the dock paid out and he counted the full 640 onto the kitchen table in the mixed small bills of a man who did not keep money in accounts, and pushed it into an envelope, and did not sleep well anyway because 410 of it had come from somewhere the ledger didn't know about and never would. The somewhere was the clinic on Gantry Street, and the reason had a name, and the name was fever. Ren had spiked 2 weeks prior that the free clinic's diagnostic kit had shrugged its digital shoulders at some low-grade colonial bug, that human immune systems on Persic apparently caught the way people back on Earth caught colds, according to the tired human doctor who'd seen 40 kids with the same thing that week, and had exactly 1 course of the synthesized antiviral left in stock. Priced for people who had guild dental plans and hazard insurance and the kind of jobs that came with both. Tobias had bought it anyway. He would have sold the loading crane if the loading crane had been his to sell. He told himself, handing over the credits, that he'd make it back before rent. He had made almost all of it back, not quite all. He didn't resent the gap. That was the strange thing, the thing he couldn't have explained to anyone who hadn't lived it. The gap wasn't an injustice done to him. It was just arithmetic, the ordinary arithmetic of being a single father with a dock job on a colony where humans were 3 generations into being tolerated and maybe 1 generation into being trusted, and he had made his peace with arithmetic a long time ago. What he hadn't made peace with, not yet, was the particular flavor of dread that lived behind his sternum every time that specific knock came on that specific door. 3 even strikes. A pause, 1 more. Because Ren had already lost 1 parent to bad luck, and Tobias had promised himself, in the raw stupid days right after, that she would never lose the second one to a spreadsheet. Ren's mother had died in a transit accident on the orbital ring 3 years back, a decompression failure on a shuttle that should never have been cleared for launch, one of those disasters that got a line in the incident report and nothing else, because the shuttle company had better lawyers than the grieving had lawyers, and Tobias had spent the first year afterward mostly just surviving the shape of the days, feeding Ren, working the dock, forgetting twice to feed himself. He didn't talk about it much, not because it still broke something loose in his chest when he did, though it did, but because Ren was old enough now to remember pieces of her mother on her own terms, and he had decided early that his grief didn't get to crowd out the space where her memories were still forming. What he had left of that year was a kind of permanent, low-grade vigilance, the sense that the world took things from you without warning and without asking, and that the only defense against it was to hold on hard to what you still had and never, ever let the ledger convince you it was optional. It was that vigilance, more than anything, that made the knock on the 2nd of the month land the way it did. Not fear of Sarai specifically, not even fear of the guild, but the older, deeper fear that had lived in him since the shuttle report, the one that said the world could always ask for 1 more thing than you had left to give. He was still thinking about that Friday morning when the knock came again, early, 20 minutes before the office hour Sarai kept for collections, and he opened the door already holding the envelope out like a shield. She didn't take it right away. "You're early," he said. "I finish the floor faster when people don't argue with me." She looked at the envelope, then at him, and something about the exchange seemed to cost her a beat longer than it should have. "You found it." "Told you I would. People tell me a great many things they don't do." She took the envelope, counted it with a speed that made the counting look decorative rather than necessary, and logged it into the slate. 640, cleared, no penalty. "Thank you. It's not a kindness, Kessler. It's the arrangement clearing." "I know, thank you anyway." She looked at him the way she had the first time, the geological pause, and Tobias got the distinct impression, not for the first time, though he couldn't have said why he kept getting it, that being thanked for doing her job unsettled her more than being shouted at would have. Most of Holloway Row shouted at her, eventually, or went quiet and cold, or slid documents under her office door rather than hand them across a threshold. He had never once seen anyone thank her. "Your daughter," Sarai said, in the tone of someone changing the subject to something equally official. "Is she well? Last week she looked flushed." The question caught him sideways. It was not on any form. It was not, as far as he understood the guild's operating procedures, any of her business, and he found himself answering it anyway, because there was something in the flat directness of the asking that made it feel less like small talk and more like an audit she decided to run on her own initiative. "She's better. Colonial fever," the clinic said, went around half the building. "I heard." Sarai's jaw did something that on a human face might have been the ghost of a wince. "The Gantry Street Clinic charges 400 credits for the treatment course. I have seen the receipts. I processed the wage garnishments for 3 families on this row who took payment plans for it." Tobias said nothing. There was nothing in that sentence that was a question, and he had learned, over 11 months, that Sarai Vondrak volunteered information the way other people paid down debts, reluctantly, and only when the weight of carrying it had become heavier than the cost of setting it down. "That's a significant sum," she said, "to come up with in 14 days on a dock loader's wage. And yet you did not ask for an extension until the amount fell 4% short." "I don't like asking for extensions." Evidently, most people ask before the shortfall, not after, so the request looks less like a confession. She tucked the slate under one arm. "It is an unusual way to manage a debt. Inefficient. But not dishonest." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." But she held his gaze a half-second longer than the observation required, and behind him in the kitchen, the kettle, the good thought, not very good tea kettle, had just begun, very faintly, to sing. "We really do have tea," Wren called out, not looking up from the table where she was drawing something with the stub of a colored pencil. "If you want to not be too tall in the hallway." Tobias watched Sarai Vondrak, 3 feet taller than him, and built along lines that made the doorway look like it had been drawn for a smaller species entirely. Stand very still in the corridor of a tenement she had legal authority to empty out from under him with a single unfiled notice, and consider, with what looked like genuine and slightly alarmed deliberation, whether to come inside. "I have 4 more units," she said again. But this time she said it like an excuse. She did not come in that day. She came in 11 days later, on an unscheduled Tuesday that had nothing to do with rent, because the pipe above 4C had finally given up the argument it had been having with the building's ancient plumbing for 3 winters, and flooded the ceiling of Unit 3C directly below. And the tenant in 3C had filed the complaint with the guild office, and the guild office had sent Sarai because she was, in point of fact, the only collector on staff who also held a maintenance certification. A fact the matriarch found endlessly useful and Sarai found endlessly exhausting. Tobias was up on a chair with a wrench when she arrived, because he'd heard about the leak from the woman in 3C an hour before the guild had, and he did not believe in waiting for paperwork when a pipe was actively ruining someone's ceiling. "That's guild property," Sarai said from the doorway, in the exact tone she used for rent. "It's my ceiling. It's the guild's pipe." Then the guild's pipe is about to stop leaking into a woman's bedroom whether the guild sends someone this week or not. He didn't look down from the chair. "You want to hold the light, or you want to file a complaint about the complaint?" There was a silence long enough that he thought she might actually leave. Then he heard the door close, and the particular percussive weight of Keith Ronnie boots crossing a human-scaled floor. And a moment later, a very tall, very stern collector was holding a work light at precisely the angle he needed without being asked, watching him work with an attention that felt less like supervision and more like the specific interest of someone who had, perhaps, never watched anyone fix anything for free. "You're not a maintenance tech," she said. "Dock loader, but you learn things living somewhere long enough. Pipe's the same pipe whether it's on a cargo ship or a tenement wall. The guild has certified maintenance staff for this. The guild's certified maintenance staff takes 11 days on average to show up, according to the woman in 3C, whose bedroom ceiling has been slowly turning into a lake for a week and a half." He tightened the last fitting, checked it, ran a hand along the pipe to feel for give. "I wasn't going to let Marta sleep under that. You did this for someone else's apartment, on your own time, with your own tools. It's not a big thing." "It is, actually," Sarai said, and something in her voice had changed register entirely, gone from procedural to genuinely, carefully curious, a fairly significant thing. "I have adjusted payment plans for 41 human households on this row in the past year. I have never once had a tenant volunteer labor for a neighbor's unit rather than demand the guild move faster. It is, statistically, an outlier. Maybe your statistics need more time on the row." He climbed down off the chair, wiped his hands on a rag and looked up, properly up, the whole distance of her, for the first time without a door frame or a debt between them. "People help each other here. It's mostly what we've got." Sarai looked at the dry, sealed pipe, and then at him, and something crossed her face that he still didn't have the vocabulary to read, 3 months into knowing the specific geography of her expressions, but that he would later come to understand as the particular vertigo of a person who has spent her whole professional life collecting evidence for a conclusion and has just been handed a data point that refuses to fit it. "I was taught," she said slowly, "that humans on this colony default on obligations at nearly twice the rate of any other tenant population, that you are, as a rule, unreliable, resentful of structure, that the kindest thing the guild can do for you is enforce the ledger strictly, because leniency only teaches you that debts are negotiable. And I have spent 11 months watching you sell your own tools before you'd sell your daughter's medicine, fix a stranger's ceiling on unpaid hours, and thank me repeatedly, inexplicably, for doing the job that could put you on the street." She set the work light down with more care than the object required. "The ledger does not have a column for that. I don't know where to enter it." Tobias didn't have a smart answer for that, so he didn't try to find one. He just said, "You want that tea now, it's still not very good." This time she stayed. Word travels fast on a row where everyone's business is, by necessity, everyone else's. And by the following week it had gotten around Holloway Row that the collector had been seen twice on the 4th floor without a ledger in hand. Marta from 3C brought it up first, cornering Tobias by the male slots with the particular directness of a woman who had survived 40 years of tenement politics and had no patience left for subtlety. "That's the collector I keep seeing coming out of your place at odd hours," she said. "It wasn't a question." "She fixed your ceiling, Marta." "She fixed my ceiling, and then, from what I hear, she kept coming back after it was fixed." Marta studied him with the frank suspicion of someone who had watched too many families on this row get squeezed by guild paperwork to trust a collector on site, giant or otherwise. "You know what she does for a living, Tobias. You know what she could do to you if this goes sideways." "I know. And you're letting her in your kitchen anyway." She sat in my kitchen before I decided anything about letting her, Tobias said, and found, saying it, that it was true that somewhere between the pipe and the tea and the long, quiet evenings going over nothing in particular, the deciding had simply happened on its own, the way water finds the low ground without anyone drawing it a map. She's not what the ledger says she is, Marta. She's not what her job trained her to be either. I don't know what to call that except worth finding out about. Marta didn't look convinced, not yet, but she didn't argue further, and 2 weeks later Tobias came home to find her sharing a pot of the good coffee. The coffee Marta kept for guests she actually liked, with Sarai in the little common room off the stairwell, the two of them deep in an argument about whether Keithrani hair really made adequate climbing rope or whether that was, as Marta put it, the kind of thing collectors say to make themselves sound more interesting. By the second month, half the row had stopped going quiet when Sarai's boots sounded in the corridor, and by the third, the Alconquos had started leaving a second chair out on rent days without being asked. It was, Tobias thought, watching it happen in small pieces he could never quite catch the seams of, the strangest kind of vindication. Not the row deciding Sarai was safe, exactly, but the row deciding, one wary interaction at a time, that safety wasn't actually the question anymore. She had become, without any of them voting on it, simply someone who belonged to Holloway Row rather than someone sent to police it. Wren adored her within the week, in the uncomplicated, total way that children adore anyone who treats their questions as worth answering. Sarai Vondrak, it turned out, had opinions about everything from the tensile strength of Keithrani hair. It's load-bearing, we use it for climbing rope in the home provinces. Don't pull it, I need it. To the correct proportion of sugar to tea. You are using far too much. This is not tea. This is a dessert wearing a disguise. And she delivered all of it in the same flat, exacting register she used for rent notices, which Wren found endlessly hilarious and which Tobias found, against every instinct he had spent a career building, endlessly disarming. "Why are you so big?" Wren asked her once, perched on the counter with her chin in her hands, watching Sarai fold her considerable frame onto a kitchen chair that had not been built with her in mind, and that groaned in mild protest at the accommodation. Keithrani are large. It's a resource management trait from our homeworld. Greater body mass retains heat more efficiently across long cold seasons. It's not remarkable to us. It only looks remarkable here, in your doorways. Sarai took a careful sip of the too-sweet tea and did not comment further on its sweetness, which Tobias had begun to understand was its own small concession. Your doorways are inconvenient. Is it lonely? Being so much bigger than everyone? The question landed with more weight than a 7-year-old could have intended, and Tobias watched it land, watched Sarai go very still in the particular way she went still, when something had gotten past whatever ledger she kept for her own feelings. "Sometimes," Sarai said after a while, "at the guild hall I am the largest person in most rooms and also frequently the youngest voice anyone listens to. Size does not translate into being heard. My mother believes it should. I have found in practice that it mostly translates into people assuming you don't need anything from them." She looked, not at Wren, but at Tobias, holding a chipped mug 2 sizes too small for her hand. "It is a strange thing, to be offered tea by people who have every reason to resent you, and to receive nothing at all from people who owe you nothing and could easily spare it." "You could just say you're sad instead of saying a whole paragraph about it," Wren observed, with the devastating clarity only children deploy, and Sarai Vondrak, giant and armored and 11 months into holding this family's survival in a data slate, laughed, a short, surprised, entirely unguarded sound that Tobias had never once heard her make in a corridor, and that he found himself, immediately and with some alarm, wanting to hear again. He learned her family in pieces, the way you learn the shape of a coastline by walking it rather than by looking at a map, not all at once, and mostly by accident, on the evenings she stayed later than the pipe or the rent or any official reason required, evenings that had started as maintenance visits and had, without either of them quite marking the transition, become something closer to just visits. Her mother, Ilseviet Vondrak, ran the guild the way she had run every institution she'd ever touched, as an extension of her own certainty. Sarai was the eldest daughter and by Keithrani custom, the presumptive heir to the collection seat, a position that came with authority, income, and the permanent, exhausting expectation that she would embody the guild's founding principle. That structure, applied without exception, was itself a form of mercy, because it meant no one was ever surprised by what the ledger required of them. "My mother believes leniency is a lie you tell people to make them like you," Sarai said one evening, watching Ren color at the table while Tobias made a dinner stretched thin enough for three. "She is not wrong that it can be. She has simply never once, in 40 years of collecting, allowed for the possibility that it can also just be true." "And you?" "I used to think she was right." Sarai turned the mug in her hands, her own mug now, kept in the cupboard, a fact none of them had discussed and all of them had quietly agreed to. "I have collected on this row for 4 years. I have filed 43 eviction notices in that time, and I did not lose sleep over any of them, because the ledger was the ledger, and the ledger does not lie. And now I have watched a man fix a stranger's pipe on his own hours and offer me tea on the day he was short on rent, and I no longer know whether the ledger tells the whole truth, or only the part of it that's convenient to measure." She looked at him, direct and unguarded in a way she had learned to be, slowly, over months in this kitchen and nowhere else. "I don't know what to do with that, Tobias." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He didn't have an answer for her that night. He had instead the growing, careful, entirely inconvenient understanding that he had stopped dreading the second of the month somewhere in the last several weeks, and had started instead, quietly looking forward to it. Not for the rent, never for the rent, but for the 3 even knocks and the pause and the one more, and the woman on the other side of the door who had begun, without either of them naming it. To feel less like the person who could take his home away, and more like the person he most wanted to come home to. The trouble arrived the way trouble on Holloway Road generally did, not as a single blow, but as a notice, official, embossed with the Vondrak Guild seal, delivered by courier drone to every unit on the block on a gray Tuesday morning, while Tobias was on the dock in Sarai, was 3 floors up in the Guild Tower, staring at the same notice on her own desk with her mother standing over her shoulder. Redevelopment Advisory, HALLOWAY Row Tenement Block. Effective in 60 days, the block's human tenancy would be terminated in full. The structure would be demolished and rebuilt as premium Keithrani residential housing, a project Ilseviet Vondrak had been quietly negotiating with the Colonial Development Board for 8 months, structured to triple the guild's yield on the land and require, as its only real cost, the eviction of every family Sarai had spent 4 years collecting from Marta in 3C, the elderly Okonkwo's in 2A, and the Kesslers, father and daughter, in 4C. "You'll deliver the notices personally," Ilseviet said, in the tone she used for decisions she had made 3 weeks ago and was only now announcing. "You know the tenants. It will go more smoothly coming from a familiar collector than a stranger. 60 days is not enough time for 41 households to find new housing in a district that has none to spare. 60 days is what the development schedule allows. It is generous, as these things go." "It is not generous. It is a number the ledger allows." Sarai heard her own words come back to her, the exact ones she'd used on a doorstep 11 months ago, and something in her chest went very cold and very still, the way it did in the seconds before a storm broke on the home provinces. "Mother, I know these families. I know their names. I know which ones are current on rent, and which ones are 2 days from being current, and which ones fixed my own guild's pipe on unpaid hours rather than let a neighbor sleep under a leak. I don't need you to know their names, Sarai. I need you to deliver the notices. And if I refuse?" Ilsevet Vondrak looked at her daughter with an expression Sarai had seen her turn on defaulting tenants, negotiating rivals, and once, memorably, an entire colonial tribunal. The look of a woman for whom the answer to every question had already been calculated, and who found the asking of the question at this point mostly a formality. "Then I will find a collector who will," her mother said, "and you will have accomplished nothing except demonstrating that you are not, in fact, ready for the seat I have spent your whole life preparing you for." Sarai did not deliver the notice to 4C by drone. She walked it there herself, on foot, through the whole freezing length of the Low-Market district, and she knocked on the door the old way, 3 even strikes, a pause, one more, because some part of her needed the ritual of it even as she was about to break everything the ritual had ever meant. Tobias opened the door and knew, before she said a word, that this was not a rent visit. She was holding the slate the way she'd held it that very first morning, like a verdict, except now her hands weren't quite steady on it, and her face had none of the flat professional calm he'd once mistaken for the whole of her. "They're taking the block," she said. 60 days, my mother's project. I was ordered to deliver this personally, and I did not know how to do it any other way because you deserve to hear it from someone who," she started again. "You deserve better than a drone notice, and I could not make myself send one." He took the slate from her hands, read the notice twice, and felt the floor do the thing it hadn't done in 11 months, not shift, this time, but genuinely, finally drop. 60 days, he said. Ren's whole school is here. Marta's 71 years old. She's lived in 3C for 40 of them. Where does your mother think 41 families go in 60 days? She doesn't think about it. That's the entire architecture of how she operates. The number is sound, the yield is sound, the paperwork is sound, and the people inside the paperwork are a variable she has trained herself not to see. Sarai's voice cracked on the last word, a fracture so unlike her that Ren, drawn by the sound from the next room, appeared in the doorway and simply stood there, watching, uncharacteristically silent. "I have spent 4 years being exactly that trained. And I find that I cannot do it to you. I cannot do it to any of you. And I don't know what that makes me, except a collector who has failed the one job she was raised for." "It makes you someone who finally looked," Tobias said quietly. She stayed until nearly midnight that night, not because the redevelopment had a solution yet, but because none of them could bear the idea of her walking back into the guild tower alone with nothing but her mother's certainty waiting for her. And it was somewhere in the second hour, going through 11 months of guild filings Sarai had brought with her out of some instinct she couldn't yet name, that Tobias found it, a single clause. Buried in the original 90-year-old founding charter of the Vondrak Collections Guild, the document that predated Ilsevet, predated the redevelopment board, predated everything except the original settlement agreement between the first Keithrani landholders and the first human tenant families on Persic. Tenancies exceeding 15 consecutive years under continuous good standing shall not be terminated for the purpose of redevelopment absent unanimous consent of the Tenancy Council, so recorded in perpetuity by the founding charter, to protect the earliest settlers of the Low-Market district from displacement by later commercial interest. "Marta's been in 3C for 40 years, Tobias said slowly, reading it a third time to be sure. "The Okonkwo's 31. There's got to be a dozen households on this row that clear 15 years easy." Sarai took the file from him, read the clause herself, and for the first time since the notice had arrived, something that was not despair moved across her face. "This predates the modern charter my mother operates under. She either doesn't know it exists, or she's assumed no one else does either." Sarai stood, and for a moment she looked less like a collector and more like exactly what she was, the presumptive heir to a guild seat, about to use that inheritance for the first time for something other than what it had been built to do. A unanimous tenancy council vote can block the redevelopment outright. It requires the council to convene formally, before the guild hall on the record. My mother would have to answer for it in front of the very board she's been negotiating with. Can you call that vote? As acting collector for this block, yes. I have never once used that authority for anything but rent. Sarai looked at him, and then longer at Ren, asleep now on the couch with a colored pencil still loose in one hand. I am about to use it against my own mother, in a room full of people who have spent 4 years believing I was exactly what she raised me to be. I don't know what happens to me afterward, Tobias. I only know what happens to this block if I don't. There was no time to be graceful about it. A tenancy council vote required, by the charter's own arcane language, a quorum of affected households physically present and accounted for on the record, and Sarai had exactly 4 days to make that happen before the redevelopment board's scheduled ratification meeting rendered the whole question moot. They split the row between them that first evening, Sarai taking the upper floors, where her face was known and, increasingly, trusted, and Tobias taking the lower ones, going door to door with a printout of the charter clause and the particular patience of a man who had spent 11 months learning exactly how frightened his neighbors already were of paperwork. It was not, in the beginning, an easy sell. Fear made people cautious, and caution, on Holloway Row, usually meant keeping your head down and hoping the trouble found someone else's door first. Why would I put my name on anything that goes up against the guild? Old Okonkwo said, arms folded in his doorway, when the guild is the reason any of us have a roof at all. Because the guild isn't your landlord tonight, Tobias said. Ilsevet Vondrak is, and she's about to take that roof anyway, whether you sign or not. The only thing the vote changes is whether you had a say in it. It took 3 of the 4 days, and it took Sarai standing in doorways she'd only ever stood in with a slate and a penalty clause, explaining patiently, plainly, without a single word of the flat collector's register she'd once hidden behind, exactly what the charter said, and exactly what it would cost her personally to invoke it. Some of the row signed because they trusted Tobias. Some signed because Marta had already signed and Marta's word carried weight 3 generations deep. A few signed only after watching Sarai fold herself down to a child's eye level in the Okonkwo's cramped hallway to answer, with total seriousness, 6-year-old Priya Okonkwo's question about whether giants got evicted too. By the 4th night they had 39 households confirmed, 2 still undecided, and Sarai sat at Tobias's kitchen table with the tally sheet in front of her, and an expression he hadn't seen on her before, not the flat professional calm, not the careful new tenderness, but something rower, closer to fear. If we don't reach unanimous, the vote doesn't count. My mother's counsel will find that clause the moment it's filed and argue partial consent invalidates the whole council. She pressed both hands flat against the table, as if she could hold the number steady by force. 2 households, Tobias. I have spent 4 years learning exactly how to make people afraid of me. I don't know how to do the opposite quickly enough. You already did it, he said. 39 people signed a document against their own landlord's mother because they believe you. That's not the ledger talking. That's you. The last 2 signatures came in the morning, before the meeting. One from a young widower on the 2nd floor who'd heard from 3 separate neighbors that the tall collector had personally walked Marta's grocery cart up 4 flights the week the lift broke, and one from a woman on the ground floor who signed. She said, simply because Ren Kessler had told her daughter that Sarai gave the best hair braiding lessons on the row, and if a child trusted her that plainly, a grown woman could stand to trust her that far too. The guild hall on the morning of the tenancy council vote was not built for this many humans, and it showed 41 households from Holloway Row crowded into a chamber designed for Keith Ronnie business, standing in a space that made them all look, deliberately or not, smaller than the room intended any one human to feel. Ilsevet Vondrak sat at the head of the chamber with the calm of a woman who did not yet know her own charter had a clause in it that could unmake her. And Sarai stood at the collector's podium with the file in her hands and her mother's eyes on her, and, somewhere in the crowd, Tobias Kessler holding his daughter's hand. 15 years continuous tenancy in good standing blocks redevelopment absent unanimous council consent, Sarai said, into a silence so total she could hear her own voice come back off the chamber's high stone walls. It is in the founding charter of this guild, recorded before any of us in this room were born, to protect exactly the families this redevelopment would displace. I am invoking it, on the record, as acting collector for this block. Sarai, her mother's voice carried the particular warning that had shaped 40 years of Sarai's life. This is not the venue for sentiment. It isn't sentiment, Mother. It's the charter, our charter. The one you built your whole authority on top of, and apparently never read past the parts that were useful to you. Sarai set the file down open on the podium where the whole chamber could see it. You taught me that the ledger doesn't lie. You were right. It's telling the truth right now, and the truth is that you cannot take this block. The silence that followed was the longest of Sarai's life, long enough that she could feel every eye in the chamber on her, her mother's, cold and recalculating, the development board's suddenly wary, and Tobias's at the back of the room, steady in a way that had nothing to do with the outcome of the vote, and everything to do with the fact that she had, for the first time in her professional life, chosen to be seen rather than to be feared. You would risk the seat, Ilsevit said finally, quiet enough that only the front rows heard it, for a dock loader and 40 other households who will forget your name the moment their rent is current again. I would risk the seat, Sarai said, because I finally understand what you never taught me, that structure without mercy isn't order, Mother. It's just cruelty with better paperwork. I don't want your seat if that's the price of it. The tenancy council vote, once called, was not close. 41 households, every one of them with more than 15 years on the row between them in some combination, voted in a single unanimous block to block the redevelopment, and the charter, 90 years old, older than the ambition that had tried to override it, held. Ilsevit Vondrak did not speak to her daughter again that day, and it would be some time yet before the two of them found their way back to anything resembling a relationship, a slower and harder rebuilding that neither of them would rush. But the guild hall emptied that afternoon with Holloway Row still standing, and eviction notices rescinded across the whole block, and Sarai Vondrak walked out into the gray low-market daylight not as the presumptive heir to a collection seat, but as something she had never once let herself imagine being. Simply a woman, unemployed by her own mother's fury within the hour, who had chosen a dock loader's kitchen table over a guild office, and had not, in the walking away, felt anything like loss. She found Tobias and Wren waiting for her at the edge of the crowd, and Wren reached her first, small arms only making it partway around one of Sarai's legs, which was as far as the geometry allowed, and which Sarai found in that moment to be exactly enough. "You're not tall enough for that hug," Wren informed her solemnly, patting her knee instead, "so I'm hugging the part I can reach." "It is, statistically," Sarai said, and her voice was not quite steady, "the best hug I have ever received." Tobias didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, really looked, the whole distance of her, the way he had that day in the flooded apartment, except now there was nothing official standing in the space between them. No rent, no ledger, no notice waiting to be filed. And when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the old bracing in it, none of the practiced waiting out the storm steadiness he'd carried into every second of the month for 11 months running. "You gave up everything for us," he said. "I gave up a seat I never wanted, in a system I no longer believe in, to keep the only people who ever offered me tea instead of fear." Sarai reached down, carefully, the way she had learned to do everything in this doorway-sized world, and rested one large hand against the side of his face, the gesture as gentle as her size allowed and gentler still for the effort it clearly cost her to trust it. "I did not give up anything, Tobias. I finally chose something." The weeks that followed had their own strange shape, the shape of a life reassembling itself around a decision that could not be taken back. Sarai did not find new guild work right away, and for a while she seemed almost unmoored by the absence of a ledger to organize her days around, the way a person favors a leg long after the injury that made them favor it has healed. She took odd jobs on the row instead. Maintenance work mostly. The certification she'd once used to shame Tobias off a chair now put to use fixing the very pipes she used to threaten people over. And Holloway Row, which had spent 4 years flinching at her boots in the corridor, began instead to listen for them. The way you listen for anyone whose arrival means something is about to get quietly, competently better. Ilseviet Vondrak sent one message in that first month, brief and unsigned by anything warmer than her title, informing Sarai that the guild seat remained, officially, unfilled, and that the offer to reconsider would stand for exactly as long as her mother's patience did, which both of them understood was not a generous window. Sarai did not answer it. She did not need to. Whatever the seat had once meant to her, proof of worth, proof of belonging, proof that a daughter that large could still make herself small enough to fit her mother's expectations. She had already traded it without regret for a kitchen table, a singing kettle, and a child who braided her hair on slow evenings and pronounced the results with total 7-year-old authority, acceptable for a beginner. The rent still came due on the 2nd of the month, because the guild's ordinary business continued under new collectors even after its heir apparent walked out of it, and Holloway Row still paid what it owed, because that was simply what decent people did with what they had. But the knock on 4C's door changed, in the months that followed not gone, because Sarai still came by on the 2nd, out of a habit neither of them had any interest in breaking, but different now. 3 even strikes and a pause and one more that meant something entirely unofficial, something that had nothing to do with a ledger and everything to do with a kettle already singing on the stove and a chair, since replaced, sturdy enough now to hold her. 2nd of the month, she said, the first time she knocked that way after everything, and there was something almost shy in it, a woman still learning the shape of a ritual she'd only ever performed before as a threat. "I know what day it is," Tobias said, and opened the door and did not hold out an envelope, because there was nothing left between them that needed to be paid. "You're really not tall enough for a proper hug," Wren observed from the kitchen table, not looking up from her drawing, "but Dad is. You should try his height instead." Sarai looked at Tobias for a long moment, the particular geological stillness he'd once mistaken for coldness, and now understood as the deepest kind of consideration a person could offer another, and stepped, finally, all the way through the door that had never quite fit her, into the small, warm kitchen that, somewhere in the last several months, without either of them filing the paperwork for it, had become the truest thing either of them owned. "Statistically," she said, "that is an excellent suggestion." And this time, when she reached for him, there was no ledger left to answer to, no notice waiting to be filed, nothing at all standing between the giant alien woman who had once come to take his home away and the human who had, without meaning to, without a single official form to record it, become the whole of what she'd been looking for, only the singing kettle, and the small girl grinning over her drawing, and the 2nd of the month arriving from now on, like an invitation instead of a warning.